What's this? Oh dear, it's the Alcid. This creature may resemble the noble centaur, but where equines are best suited to the open plains, the nimble, deer-like bodies of the Alcid are well suited to the woodlands where they reside. This is just one of the extraordinary creatures who make their home on our plane.
Everyone gets amped about new official D&D books, but did you know that in between every rulebook or adventure setting, dozens of third-party publishers are releasing books full of content for D&D that is just as good as, and sometimes even better than, the official stuff? There are so many reasons to try third-party content. Maybe you feel like you've already played out all the core options in your character builds. Or maybe you're a DM and your players know so much about D&D that it's impossible to surprise them. Or maybe you've run into a problem or a weakness in your game that third-party content was specifically created to fix. It's basically like the D&D version of downloading mods for a video game. Now, just like video game mods, there are good ones and bad ones. If you've ever asked people about their favorite third-party content, you have heard of Kobold Press, the sponsor for this video. They're known for creating a huge variety of really in-depth, thoroughly play-tested content, from monsters to campaign settings and back. Today, I specifically want to show you their new book, Tome of Heroes, which is focused on player options, but also has some frankly incredible resources for DMs on things like downtime activities and creating connections within your party. They funded this book on Kickstarter, so if you pre-order it at the link in the description, you are also getting the benefit of nearly $400,000 in stretch goals worth of added content. Today, I'm gonna walk you through this book, not just to show you what's in it, but also to show you how to bring third-party content into your game in general. Plus, there's a cool deer centaur, and I will be trying out my best attempt at an Irish accent. Huh?
Ah, you're curious about the Alcid. Most are. My people rarely leave their homes in the woodlands. The forest is a living creature, and too many outsiders see it instead as an obstacle or a resource. My people can even be dangerous to those who don't respect the wood.
The first chapter covers races, and that includes both brand new races like the Alcid and new sub-races for core classes, like the Riverfolk Halfling or the Frostfell Elf. Some of the new races are irresistibly cute, like the Irina, who are little hedgehog guys, and the Mushroom Folk, which I would 100% be using for this video if I thought I could effectively cosplay them. But they're not all cottagecore pandering. I say that lovingly as a cottagecore sucker who loves being pandered to. Some of the races are more for the goth and metal type. For example, one of the new races is the Darakul, who are undead and get different stats depending on what race they were before they died. They've even made Shade a playable race, so you can play as a spirit that lingers after death. The new sub-races are mostly location specific, like the Dunewalker and Frostfell Elves, who are from the desert and the Arctic, respectively, or the Spindrift Dwarves, who spend their lives at sea. But there are also some wackier ones, like Weird Gnomes, who can catch glimpses of the future. I'm predictable and obsessed with centaurs, so obviously I had to pick the Alcid to cosplay for this video, which are half elf, half deer. These are inspired by the nymphs of glens and groves that the ancient Greek poet Homer talked about in some of his writings. There's a lot of fun lore for this race, like the culture around their antlers.
All Alcids have antlers, and you can look at them to figure out how old we are, because they branch about once every 10 years. As you can see from mine, I'm in my 30s. But once you hit a century, they only branch by the blessing of the forest. That's why it's so rare to see an Alcid with more than a dozen points.
If I didn't love the aesthetic of antlers so much, I might have made my character an Alcid exile, because the worst punishment they perform on one another is to saw off their antlers, which is extremely metal. Each race has this level of detail, not just stats, but story and context that you can use to build your character. I love how lore can spark fun ideas for backstories and characters that I might not have come up with on my own. New races means new concepts to play with in your creative process. Now, I know that a lot of DMs are hesitant to allow full third-party races into their games over concerns about balance and compatibility. But I have to say, as far as broken homebrew goes, I think race is probably one of the lowest risk places to diverge from the core rules. Ability score improvements and features like dark vision and weapons proficiencies are pretty standardized across D&D races, so it's easy to compare a homebrew race to a core race and see at a glance if they look like they're in line. Plus, you can always make tweaks as you go if something isn't working. Don't be afraid of taking risks and trying new things, because you're not locked into anything.
Oh, I told you, the woodland is a living thing, and if you protect it, it'll protect you. As a grove warden, I've earned the forest's trust and its blessing. My senses can travel through the roots of growing things, and when I'm in danger, the earth itself will come to my aid.
There are over 70 subclasses in this book, some for each of the 12 core D&D classes, and I pretty much guarantee that you'll fall in love with at least one of them. There's the Cat Burglar Rogue, the Portal Cleric, the Way of the Dragon Monk, the Black Powder Sorcerer, so many options. I know I have a really specific area of interest here, but if you're into nature shit, you're gonna have a hard time picking a favorite. I feel like there's just a wealth of wonderful nature-y content in this book. There's a druid circle called the Circle of Bees, where you can control stinging insects and grow a stinger to use for unarmed strikes and speak the bee language, which is called Bee Dance. At 14th level, you get a feature called Mantle of Bees. I'm sorry, it took so much willpower not to pick this one. You can take a warlock patron that's a primeval forest called the Old Wood. The flavor for the pact boons is just immaculate. Your familiar can be an awakened shrub, and if you're pact of the tome, you have to plant your spellbook in the ground for it to grow new spells. But despite the lure of these subclasses, I already play a druid and a warlock, and I've been curious about rangers lately, so for this character, I picked the Grove Warden Ranger archetype, which lets you do things like sense nearby humanoids when you're in the forest, or use an area of effect move that makes the earth move so that enemies have to make dex saves or be pushed and fall prone.
The forest helps me in small ways now, but as our bond grows, and I continue to prove myself its protector, the powers it can grant me are remarkable. The plants and earth will literally rise up to attack my foes, or stand as a shield between me and one who means me harm.
With over 70 subclasses in this book, I just want to remind you that you don't have to make all of them available to your players. That is a lot. Instead, maybe one of your players specifically has a story developing for their character that doesn't quite line up with the available subclasses in the core rule set. In that case, one of these subclasses might just be a better fit for the story you're telling. There are multiple subclasses in this book that suit my player characters better than whatever reflavored, reskinned, multi-class combinations I've come up with trying to make their abilities match the idea that I have in my head.
Most Alciad are raised amongst the trees, but as far as I know, I'm the only one who was raised by one. When my people were killed in a terrible forest fire, Oakshadow did what all treants do. He protected the forest. As the last survivor of my grove, I was a pair to that duty.
There are much fewer background options and an even smaller number of feats than there are race and class options, but a lot of them feel pretty tied to the other character options in this book, so they're sort of supplementary. Like, if you create a Dune Walker elf, you might want to take the Desert Runner background. Or for a Winterfolk halfling, you might take the Rhymecaster feat, which lets you do fun stuff with cold damage. Some of the backgrounds are great resources for players who might need a little help with backstory ideas, like the Destined background, which means the character has some sort of duty or responsibility they're expected to fulfill someday, like an arranged marriage, an inherited title, or a family business. Or the Innkeeper background, which I just think is very cute and would make for some really fun characters.
My name isn't a true Alciad name, by the way. Mija, short for Artemisia, it's a sort of a plant, which makes sense if a tree named ya. But when Oakshadow found me, I was too young to know my own name, and with all my people dead, I suppose I'll never know.
I gave Mija my favorite background in this book, Monstrous Adoptee. It's basically a raised by wolves type background, but raised by whatever you want. Aberrations, dragon, fae. Since she's a protector of the forest, both through her race and her subclass, I loved the idea of her being raised by a treant, a creature that also protects the forest. Plus, if you watched Merry and Pippin just chillin' on Treebeard's limbs while he stomped around the forest and didn't want to live that dream, I can't relate to you. Imagine a big old tree dude taking care of a little Alciad fawn. Is that not the cutest shit? Also, from a DM's perspective, I love this mysterious forest fire that killed her people and left her to be raised by a treant, because that just leaves so many options open. Not only does it give her a clear reason to go adventuring, to figure out what caused it, to take revenge, to prevent future tragedies, to learn more about her people, the options are infinite. But also, that fire could be tied to a larger plot line in this world, or even to another character's backstory.
Who better to teach the magic of plants than a tree? I've been learning hedgecraft since I was knee-high to a myconid. Not only have I learned to recognize magic plants in the wild, I've even learned to cultivate some of my own.
So the Hedgecraft feat has some basic features, like advantage on locating and identifying magic plants, and letting you literally cultivate your own little magic plants to keep with you and use, but it's also tied to another feature of this book, which is an entirely new magical discipline called Hedge Magic. Hedge Magic is all about using magical plants to cast spells. I'm actually obsessed with this system. The book includes a whole glossary of magic plants, including a visual description and where they might be found. Then, each plant has 3 possible spell several levels that it can be used at, each level doing different things. For example, there's a plant called Champion's Lavender, which usually grows near shrines. For a single-use spell, you can press the flower to a wound and the target can immediately use a hit die. But if you're at least 3rd level and the flower is fresh, you can perform a ritual to create a ward that reveals invisible creatures. And at 5th level, and with the Hedgecraft feat, you can cultivate a garden of Champion's Lavender, which can magically reveal deception or guilt. There's 15 different plants and they all have 3 levels of use like that. It's incredible, it's such an in-depth system, and it's literally just a tiny part of this book. There's also a second new magic discipline called Draconic Runes, which can be inscribed and then empowered with magic on a daily basis to enhance or replicate spells. For example, the rune Corporis eliminates the need for material components worth 50 gold or less. But back to backgrounds and feats, I know that you don't have to take backgrounds literally, and that you can choose to ignore the flavor and just focus on the mechanics. But whether you come up with the backstory first and then match the background to it as best you can, or use the background options to come up with your backstory, the bottom line is more backgrounds means more options.
I'm wary of fire for obvious reasons. When I told Oakshadow I was leaving the forest, he got me this, a heart-glow lantern. It doesn't burn, it glows with life energy. In fact, if I sacrifice some of my own vitality, it can even do things like detect undead or let me breathe underwater. I'm not sure what kind of trouble Oakshadow thinks we'll be getting into out there, to be honest. Hopefully I won't ever need it for anything but a nightlight.
Weapons, armor, explosives, clockwork, trinkets, magic items. If you love stuff, Tome of Heroes has a ton for you. Special blades, whips, firearms, new kinds of armor, practical items like a surgery kit and beekeeper's tools, and plenty of rules for stuff that you've honestly probably already included in your game, just without mechanical guidance, like explosives. This book has rules for gunpowder, including guidance for DMs on how to incorporate gunpowder and firearms into your games, stats for a few different types of firearms, and even optional rules for things like misfires. There's a whole system for elemental bottles, which are basically like magical Molotov cocktails. There's a section on clockwork creations with incredibly badass stuff like a clockwork warhorse mount or a clockwork owl that can keep watch, and a D100 table of trinkets in case you need backstory hooks or shop inventory or miscellaneous loot. I love a good magic item like the Heartglow lantern that I gave Mija, or this dagger called the Moment Blade. If you crit with it, the target skips forward in time 1 round, basically losing their turn. Just tons of super creative stuff in here. I think items are the easiest third-party content to incorporate into a game because they're the perfect rewards or loot, and they can really make shopping feel exciting, instead of just walking into a blacksmith shop and knowing that they probably stock exactly the same little table of armor and weapons as every other blacksmith. I think they're especially helpful if your players already know all of the magic items in the core rulebooks. I felt really bad in my first D&D game because the DM introduced an alchemy jug and I knew about it from Critical Role and just immediately accidentally metagamed and told everyone at the table what it does, like a jerk. But if you bring in items that your players don't know, that really amps up the mystery and the excitement of items.
I don't know what it'll be like out there, outside the forest, but I hope I'm not totally cut off from the land. I've learned to cultivate a lot of magic plants out here, and if you can give them some time, they can offer you a lot of power in return.
I've gotten a lot of requests for a video about downtime activities, but I honestly don't think I can offer anything even a fraction as useful as the concepts in Tome of Heroes. There are rules for everything from establishing a reputation at a royal court, which you can then cash in for benefits, to raising and training creatures to use as mounts or sell or breed, to creating and running a criminal enterprise. Mija would naturally make use of the magic plant gardening activity, which would enable her to cultivate some of the plants that she uses in her hedgecraft. A lot of this is stuff that you might have done before in a D&D game, but without rule sets. It's all well and good to roleplay raising a mount or pet or establishing and running a keep, but actually letting those choices impact the mechanics of the game is next level. The other absolutely golden resource for DMs in this section is group themes. Anyone who's ever used the classic "you meet in a tavern" hook in session 1 knows how hard it can be to bring a party together if you don't make an effort to establish common goals or connections between characters. Group themes, which should be established as a party before gameplay begins, are designed to not just link the party narratively, but also to offer mechanical benefits that apply to the whole group. For example, some parties may share the haunted theme because everyone is plagued by a supernatural force of some kind. As a group, they have benefits like strength in numbers, which means that characters can't be surprised and have advantage against being frightened when they are within 30 feet of other group members. There's even adventure advice and suggested quest hooks for each group theme. For instance, your haunted group might share a strange dream pointing them to a specific location, or hear rumors of a priest who might be able to help help them banish their troubles forever. Last but not least, there is a huge list of brand new spells, and to make sure the non-magical fighters don't feel left out, there is also a collection of weapon options. Now that I play a barbarian, I'm definitely noticing how often my entire contribution to combat is just, I take 3 more claw attacks. Weapon options allow more interesting strategic interactions in combat, like the pinning shot, which stops a target from moving by pinning their clothing to a nearby object or surface with a ranged weapon, or hamstring, which reduces the target's speed. Personally, I've had players ask me if they can do things like this, and I've never been quite sure how to handle it. So these mechanics might come up and become useful even if you don't actively inform your players that they're on the table. If you haven't tried bringing third-party content into your games yet, remember, you're allowed to start small. You don't have to include everything from any given book in your game. Maybe you start by just including 1 or 2 magic items in a shop or as particularly special loot. Maybe your fighter goes out of their way to roleplay training, so you reward them with 1 new weapon option to use. Maybe the wizard finds one of the new spells on a scroll or in an ancient tome, and it's exciting and unusual, perhaps lost to history. You don't have to treat a supplement like this as an additional core rulebook. You're allowed to pick and choose when you feel like the core game doesn't have what you want, or when you feel like bringing in something special or unique. Whether you're a connoisseur of third-party books or you're ready to dip your toes in for the first time, I would highly recommend Tome of Heroes from Kobold Press. This video is sponsored, but they can't make me say that. I'm being honest here, it really does have something for everyone. The character options and adventuring rules span so many themes and tones, so both players and DMs will be able to find something in here that feels exciting. If you want to pick it up, check out the link in the description and place your pre-order for a hardcover copy. It is also available in PDF. By the way, if you're interested in incorporating homebrew content, either yours or someone else's, make sure to check out my video about how to do that without breaking your game. You can watch it right here. Also, big thanks to Ralph Stickley for being my store brand David Attenborough for the intro.